I am Lisa, 34 years old, working as an accountant for a small pharmaceutical company in the suburbs of Boston. I have been married to Andrew for 6 years, and throughout all that time, I have never truly felt like I belonged in his family. From the first time I met my mother-in-law, Margaret, I sensed that something was off. It was the way her eyes scrutinized me from head to toe, the polite yet cold smile, and the sweet yet subtly sharp tone when she said, "Andrew, you didn't mention that Lisa went to community college." Then she turned to me, smiling as if giving a compliment. "Oh, how wonderful that someone can build a stable life without relying on prestige." I forced a smile. Back then, I thought, maybe she just needed time to warm up to me. I was wrong. Margaret had 2 daughters, Emily and Rachel. Both older than me, both the kind of women she took great pride in. One was a medical resident, the other a marketing director for a cosmetics brand. In their eyes, I was just an ordinary office worker, nothing noteworthy. And they made no effort to hide it. At every family gathering, Margaret always seated me at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation. Emily would start talking about late-night emergency cases, Rachel would go on about her latest ad campaign, and I would sit there, nodding and smiling at the right moments, like a shadow in my own family dinner. And Andrew? He never said a word. I once whispered to him after dinner, "I feel like I'm not welcome." He just shrugged. "You're overthinking, they just need time." Time passed. 3 months, then 3 years. Nothing changed. Holidays, family trips. I was always the last to know, if I even knew at all. Once, they went on a week-long trip to Cape Cod without saying a word to me. When I asked Andrew, he casually replied, "I thought you were busy with work, so I didn't invite you." I remember sitting in the living room, watching Andrew text his mother openly, not even trying to hide it. I asked, "Have you ever thought about standing by my side?" He looked up, slightly surprised. "Why would I take sides? Everything's fine." Everything was fine, for him. He had his mother, his sisters, cozy dinners filled with laughter, while I sat alone in the kitchen or waited outside for the car because no one noticed when I left. Margaret remained the same. Her words always sounded like compliments, but beneath them lay veiled insults. "Lisa, that lipstick color is interesting, but as long as you feel confident, that's what matters." Or, "Wow, Andrew told me you're not much of a cook, but you've kept your husband for 6 years. That's impressive." I had sat in the bathroom crying, gripping a washcloth as if it could hold back my rising anger. I didn't understand why they treated me this way. What had I done wrong? I loved Andrew. I tried everything to fit in, but not a single person in his family ever truly welcomed me. They saw me as an outsider, and what hurt me the most was, so did my husband. I had stayed silent for too long, but I wasn't the type to bow my head forever. There were things I had seen, things I knew, and one day, I would no longer stand on the sidelines. This Thanksgiving, Margaret was hosting dinner at her winter estate in Ridgefield, Connecticut. The 3-story house, covered in dried ivy and glowing with warm golden lights, looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. Everything was perfect. Except for the emptiness I felt as I stepped through the grand front door. Andrew, as always, didn't hold my hand, didn't look at me. He just rushed forward to hug his mother, then turned to his sisters. Emily, dressed in an elegant blazer with the scent of expensive perfume, laughed as she recounted a recent heart surgery. Rachel, her blonde waves perfectly styled, leaned in to kiss Margaret on the cheek. I stood there by the shoe cabinet, wondering if I was truly invited or just someone's +1. "Oh, Lisa!" Rachel was the first to acknowledge me, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. "A red dress? That's bold." She didn't smile, but her tone and expression made her message clear. I simply offered a faint smile and walked into the living room, where everyone had already gathered around the meticulously set dining table. Dinner went as it always did. Perfectly roasted turkey, homemade pumpkin pie, and the same old conversations, replayed like a worn-out tape every year. No one asked about my job or my life. I was merely decorum, silent, polite, unnoticed. After dessert, Margaret stood up and clapped her hands, her voice carrying the excitement of someone about to unveil a grand performance. Now, my favorite part, Thanksgiving gifts. Light applause spread across the table. I glanced at Andrew. He smiled as he poured himself more wine, not once looking at me. Margaret began handing out gifts wrapped in satin ribbons. A designer wallet for Rachel, a sapphire necklace for Emily, a bottle of 1998 Bordeaux for Andrew. Even Rachel's twin daughters, only 8 years old, received a limited edition Lego set. I sat up straight, hands resting lightly on my lap, saying nothing. A small flicker of hope still lingered in me. Maybe this time they wouldn't forget. Maybe. Margaret turned to me with an exaggeratedly bright smile. Lisa? Oh dear, I think I forgot to get you something. Emily burst into laughter. Rachel shrugged. No big deal. Lisa understands, right? I didn't say a word. And what hurt me more than Margaret or my sisters-in-law was Andrew, throwing his head back in laughter as if it was the funniest joke of the night. Suddenly, everything became crystal clear. 6 years of patience, 6 years of trying to find a place in a family that never wanted me. How many chances had I wasted to stand up for myself? How many times had I belittled myself just to earn a fake smile? I set my wine glass down and looked straight at Margaret. It's okay, I said, my voice as light as a breeze. Actually, I didn't forget about all of you. Silence fell over the room as if someone had switched off the music. I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with a silver ribbon. Not luxurious, not flashy, but neat and deliberate. I placed it in front of Margaret. For you, I said, keeping my smile. A very special gift. I saw a flicker of suspicion cross her face. Margaret hesitated, touching the ribbon with her fingertips as if afraid of what might be inside. Rachel and Emily leaned in. Andrew furrowed his brows. Go ahead, I murmured. Margaret unwrapped the paper, lifted the lid, and as she saw the neatly stacked papers inside, bank statements, financial transaction reports, and a summary of assets, her smile disappeared instantly. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the pages, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes filled with confusion and disbelief. I said nothing, merely pouring myself another glass of wine, savoring the thick silence blanketing the room. Rachel grabbed a handful of papers from her mother's hands and skimmed through them. Her expression changed almost immediately. Lisa! What is this? I looked up. My tone as casual as if I were discussing the weather. Financial reports from Margaret's table. The event planning company my dear mother-in-law has been running for nearly 2 decades. Emily snatched another document, her gaze turning serious. These are bank statements, income summaries, and... Is this a tax return? Exactly, I nodded, a faint smile playing on my lips, with clear evidence that Margaret has been underreporting her revenue for at least the past 6 years. Some earnings weren't declared. Some expenses were inflated or completely fabricated. Margaret set her wine glass down, but her movement was so unsteady that a few drops spilled over. She turned to me, her voice hoarse. Where did you get these? I didn't have to look far, I replied, placing my glass down as I met her eyes. Just had to pay attention. A few numbers on the company's website didn't match the revenue reports. A few grand events were heavily promoted, yet missing from tax filings. And there were cash transactions. I know, because I saw them myself. Rachel inhaled sharply. Mom, is this true? Margaret didn't answer. She was too busy trying to mask the growing panic in her eyes. I tilted my head. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I also found that the parent company received a grant from the city, supposedly for post-pandemic recovery, but that money never appeared in the financial statements. You reported it as payroll expenses, yet the only full-time employee left is your personal assistant. Andrew finally spoke, his voice unsteady. Lisa, Why would you do this? I turned to him, my gaze calm. You want to know why? For 6 years, I've been invisible in this family, left out of every conversation, every plan, every ounce of affection. I never reacted, not once. But do you know what finally woke me up, Andrew? It was tonight, when the whole table laughed because I had no gift, and you laughed along with them. Emily spoke, this time without mockery. And how long have you been investigating this? Almost a year, I replied. At first, it was just curiosity, but the more I looked, the clearer everything became. Margaret started flipping through the remaining pages in a frantic attempt to find some loophole to refute it all, but the more she turned, the paler she became. There were bank transfers from the company into her personal accounts, there were falsified receipts, there were invalid tax deductions. Rachel took a step back. Mom, you told me you couldn't help when I needed a loan to fix my house. You said the company was struggling. Emily frowned. And you told me you couldn't co-sign my daughter's tuition loan because you couldn't afford it? No one was looking at me anymore. Every gaze was now locked onto Margaret, the woman who, just minutes ago, had played the devoted mother, now struggling to keep her composure. I folded my arms. I wasn't planning to report anything, at least, not yet. I just wanted to show everyone that if I'm going to be treated like I don't exist, then I can also make sure this family remembers me. In a way no one wants. Andrew stared at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. Do you really want to destroy my mother? I met his eyes, unblinking. No, Andrew. I'm just revealing the truth. She did this to herself. A moment later, Margaret exhaled sharply, her lips trembling. You can't do this. You'll bring my entire family down with me. I looked at her, my eyes unwavering. No one forced you to commit fraud. No one made you do anything wrong. And certainly, no one made you treat me like I was worthless. Rachel's voice came out hoarse, as if she had lost all her breath. Lisa, are you absolutely sure these documents are real? I nodded. Everything is sourced from the bank and the IRS. If you want to verify, you can call the accountant your mother's company used. I've already contacted them and kept a record of the call. Emily suddenly turned to Margaret, suspicion creeping into her eyes. Mom, you told me you couldn't help when I needed to put down a deposit on a new house. You said you didn't have a single cent to spare. Rachel flipped to another page, her frown deepening. This bank transfer here, it's from Dad's account? I nodded again, this time not looking at Margaret but at the man sitting at the head of the table. Henry, Margaret's husband, Andrew's father. He had barely spoken all evening. He was a quiet man, always in the background of every family event. But now, his face was gradually draining of color. No way, he murmured, reaching for one of the documents Rachel held. His eyes scanned the transaction details. Thousands of dollars withdrawn from his retirement account over the past 3 years, marked as operating fees, reinvestment, or worse, with no label at all. Margaret spoke, her voice sharp. Henry, you don't understand. It was just a temporary transfer. No, he cut her off, his voice quiet but firm. I never authorized this. I never knew. He stood up from his chair, gripping the papers tightly, his face white as a sheet. How much of this is real, Margaret? How much did you take? What did you do with the money? Margaret's eyes darted around, her expression faltering. I did it for the family. I needed to keep the company afloat, to take care of the kids. Rachel let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You can't say you did this for us when you refused to help me when I was unemployed. You said you couldn't loan me money to fix my house, but here, she held up a document. You transferred tens of thousands into your personal account? Emily stepped next to Henry, her voice turning cold. And this? This came from Dad's retirement fund. You took the only financial safety net he had. Do you even realize how awful that is? Margaret suddenly shouted. Everything I did was to protect this family's reputation. You don't understand the pressure of maintaining our image, of making sure no one looks down on us. Henry pressed a hand to his forehead, his breathing growing labored. He clutched the edge of the table, his lips trembling. I immediately stepped forward. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. His face turned red, then ashen. "Call an ambulance," I shouted. Rachel had already pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. Emily grabbed their father's shoulders, guiding him back into his chair. Margaret stumbled back, her face pale. "Henry, no, don't do this." He gasped for air, clutching his chest, his eyes glazing over. I rushed to the front door, ready to guide the paramedics when they arrived. My mind raced with questions. Would he make it? What else had Margaret been hiding? And Andrew, would he still stand by her after everything? The sound of sirens filled the air minutes later. Paramedics rushed in, carrying a stretcher and medical equipment. Margaret screamed his name, but I noticed she didn't reach for him, didn't hold his hand, didn't whisper anything comforting. It was all just tears and cries, a clumsy performance in the play she had written. Andrew stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on the chaos in front of him. I looked at him, but this time I wasn't waiting anymore. No explanation, no apology could erase what I had endured. Andrew reached out, barely brushing my hand. "Lisa, is this real?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Too real." As the ambulance pulled away, the family stood in silence. Margaret collapsed into a chair, all her usual pride stripped away. Rachel and Emily didn't comfort her. Andrew said nothing. I stepped out onto the porch, the late November air biting against my skin. But I felt light, as if a massive weight had been lifted from my chest. The waiting room at Yale New Haven Hospital was cold and eerily quiet. The white fluorescent lights reflected off the polished tile floor, making the space feel even more impersonal. I sat on one of the stiff plastic chairs, my hands clasped together, my eyes fixed on the blank wall as if it could give me answers. Andrew sat a few seats away. He hadn't spoken since his father was taken away. Rachel and Emily were murmuring with the doctor, their faces still tense. Margaret was somewhere down the hall, a nurse checking on her after she'd claimed to feel faint. But I knew. What brought her to her knees wasn't concern for her husband. It was the truth that had just been exposed. "Lisa." Andrew's voice was so soft I almost missed it. I turned. His eyes were clouded, full of confusion and exhaustion. "This." He swallowed hard. "Did you plan all of this from the beginning? Did you do this to get revenge on my mother?" A cold shiver ran down my spine. So that was his first thought, after everything. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" But, "Did you do this to destroy my mother?" I took a slow breath. "No, Andrew, I didn't plan anything." But I couldn't pretend to be blind any longer. I've been pushed aside for too long, and this time, I chose not to stay silent. He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You don't understand. My mother isn't a bad person. She just—" I let out a laugh, though my throat tightened. "She's not a bad person. She humiliated me over and over, treated me like I was invisible. And you? You stood there, silent, smiling. Even tonight you laughed when I was cast aside in front of everyone." Andrew said nothing. I pulled off my wedding ring, the diamond catching the harsh hospital light, mocking the love I once believed in. I placed it in his hand so gently he barely reacted. "Lisa," he murmured, as if waking from a dream. I looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, but with nothing left to hold on to. "Andrew, I didn't destroy your family. They did that themselves. I just refused to stay quiet." His hand clenched around the ring, his eyes reddening. "Are you leaving me?" "No, Andrew," I said firmly. "I'm choosing myself." I turned and walked away. The automatic doors slid open before me, the cold winter wind hitting my face, sharpening my clarity. My footsteps echoed against the pavement. No hesitation, no regrets. I didn't know if Henry would survive. I didn't care what excuse Margaret would come up with. But one thing was certain. From this moment on, my life would no longer be dictated by people who never valued me. Outside the hospital, I pulled out my phone and deleted Andrew's contact. Not out of anger, but because no matter what realization he might come to in the future, I wouldn't be there waiting for him to choose me. I chose myself, and that was the first decision in 6 years that made me feel truly at peace. Just 3 days after Thanksgiving, I received a message from Rachel. Dad is filing for divorce. His lawyers submitted the paperwork this morning. Mom will lose control of the company next week. I wasn't surprised. When I left the hospital that night, I had seen something break in Henry's eyes. Not just his trust in his wife, but the patience he had carried through decades of marriage. He was the kind of man who endured, but he wasn't a fool. And when the truth came to light, he had no reason to stay anymore. Rachel and Emily quickly made their own decisions. There was no family meeting, no final conversation with their mother. The sisters hired lawyers to investigate the money Margaret had taken from the family accounts and began legal proceedings. Rachel also mentioned that she was selling her current apartment and moving to Vermont, where her husband's family lived. She didn't want her children growing up in an environment that was as deceitful and cold as the one Mom created. I didn't blame them. In fact, I respected them for finally choosing to stand up for themselves, something I had once wished I had the courage to do sooner. As for Margaret, I didn't hear much except that she had hired a legal team to clarify administrative discrepancies with the IRS. There were rumors that she was selling the Ridgefield estate to cover the damages. No one in the family was taking her calls anymore, not even Andrew. He had called me 7 times, sent 15 messages, emailed me, even wrote a handwritten letter. I read every single one but never replied. There was one line in his last letter that made me pause. I was too late, wasn't I? Yes, Andrew. You were 6 years too late. I had once wished, just once, that you would stand up for me. But you never did. And now, when everything has fallen apart, you finally understand. But I've already moved on. I changed my number, locked my social media accounts, moved out of the old apartment in Cambridge and into a small, quiet place near the Charles River. Close enough to my office that I could walk there every morning. I bought a few potted plants, a new rug, and, for the first time in years, I put up paintings I liked. Without asking for anyone's approval. One Saturday afternoon, I brewed some tea and sat down with a leather notebook I had bought long ago but never used. I wrote one sentence. I'm not waiting for you to choose me anymore because I have already chosen myself. I smiled. Not the polite, forced smile I had worn for years at family dinners, but a real smile, light, unburdened. I thought about the time I had lost, the wasted efforts to please people who never saw me as part of their family. But I no longer regretted it. Everything I had been through led me to this moment, where I knew I deserved more. I didn't know how Margaret would face the trials ahead. I didn't know if Andrew would ever truly change. But none of that mattered anymore. I had walked away from a house that had given me nothing but silence and loneliness for 6 years. I had left behind a wedding ring, a symbol of a marriage that was never fair, and I had stepped out of a shadow I never belonged to. Now I was no longer Lisa, the daughter-in-law who had to smile and stay silent. I was Lisa, the woman who knew her worth, knew when to leave, and dared to do it without regret. And if anyone ever asked me, was it worth it? I would answer with a smile brighter than any Thanksgiving gift, every single second. From my own story, I learned that silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's self-destruction. 6 years in a family that never accepted me taught me one thing. If you wait for others to give you value, you will always be forgotten. The most powerful choice I ever made wasn't leaving them, it was choosing myself. Because in this world, no one will stand up for you if you don't stand up for yourself. What do you think of Lisa's choice and how she stood up for herself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss more emotional family stories and deep life lessons.